Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Henry Wallmeyer, President and CEO of the National Club Association. It's my pleasure to be today's moderator, and we're so glad that you've joined us. The National Club Association and McMahon Group began producing club trends in the spring of 2014 to share research and insight to help club leadership identify the trends in the club industry. Our first issue focused on the family and the extraordinary influence it has on the club. 27 issues later, the family is just as, if not more, important to a club's success, especially right now. We hope this webinar will help you fully understand why. In addition to the print publication of club trends, we can now bring this to you in webinar format with the added contributions to the magazine from two of NCA's corporate partners, Copland, Keebler & Wallace, and Club Benchmarking, who along with NCA corporate partner McMahon Group comprise the Club Leadership Alliance. Because of this, we have a great agenda and lineup of topics and speakers for you today. We welcome and invite you to ask any questions of the presenters by typing your question into the question box on the right. We'll go through as many as we can at the end, time permitting. And one question that I can go ahead and answer for you now is that yes, following the webinar, you will receive a copy of these slides. Today, you're going to be hearing from some great folks. Frank and Bill from McMahon Group, Frank, Bill, and Chris from McMahon Group, Tom and Kurt from Copland, Keebler & Wallace, David and Chris from Club Benchmarking, and my colleague, Phil Mike from the National Club Association. And it's now my pleasure to welcome in Phil, NCA's Senior Communications Manager and Managing Editor, who will set the table for today's webinar by giving us the macro perspective of what is happening across the country and in hospitality and how it relates to clubs. Take it away, Phil.
Thanks, Henry. And as Henry mentioned, we are focusing on what's happening outside of the club industry with this presentation. So we're going to be looking at some of the short, mid, and potentially long-term implications of COVID to consumers, businesses, and subsequently clubs. One of the biggest impacts we've seen is that COVID has dramatically impacted the housing market. Roughly 14 to 23 million Americans are planning a move as a result of remote work. And this figure is about 3 to 4 times higher than normal rates. And in total, we're seeing about 7 to 12% of all households planning a move due to greater working from home capabilities. And as we might expect, the primary drivers of the moves are population density and cost. People want to have space, be able to distance from one another, and due to the pandemic, there's less demand to live near the conveniences of city life, and as such, 1 in 5 of these movers are leaving cities. One interesting side note is office space in New York right now. It has the most office space available since the aftermath of 9/11. So as we've seen, city clubs in particular are going to have some difficulties in the days ahead. The hospitality industry, in particular restaurants, have been upended. As of late last year, 17% of restaurants have closed. And there are some estimates that the pandemic has eliminated more than 10 years of job growth, with a full industry recovery not expected until 2024. And all about 4 million hospitality jobs have been lost, which presents opportunities for clubs, but it also is increasing competition and increasing the innovation in the restaurant industry. One of those changes we're seeing is that restaurants are shifting to fewer menu items to reduce costs and offer healthier, eco-friendly items such as immune boosters and sustainable options that appeal to people's preferences. Technology is also increasing the ways restaurants can serve patrons. Digital voice assistants can help people place orders. There's parking lot Wi-Fi, new technology that can recognize license plates, can help restaurants prepare for customers before they come in, and there's now separate lanes for people who order apps and delivery to help preserve social distance. More businesses are also committing to social justice movements, and customers, especially younger ones from more diverse groups like Gen Z, they may not be your members, but they may be your members' children. They're demanding more transparency on these fronts, and as such, restaurants will prioritize diversity through their marketing, hiring, leadership, and cuisine. Entertainment, these are places like Topgolf that combine food with activities. They were thriving before the pandemic, and now they're at a bit of a crossroads, but some are still planning on their expansions with some interesting twists. Putt Shack, which is Topgolf's putting brand, they're expanding right now, and they are weaving in safety protocols as part of its brand. And we're also seeing an acceleration in digital and physical tools in hotels. These tools are such as cell phone technology that can adjust room settings, mobile-friendly keys, and using data to improve service. As we all know, everyone's changing their spending. 75% of consumers have altered their shopping habits, and most consumers are not underestimating the virus, as they believe that the crisis's impact on their daily lives will extend for at least another 4 months. So they're prioritizing the essentials, they're cutting discretionary spending, they're flocking towards web channels for purchases and getting information, which begs the question, what is your online presence? Clubs can't necessarily advertise, but how can members and prospective members be aware of your online platforms? People are also making the best decisions for themselves, staying loyal to brands as they tighten up their spending, which emphasizes the value proposition clubs are making. And roughly just 1/3 of Americans have resumed normal activities, which is an increase, but 80% of Americans still say they feel somewhat unsafe when going out. Wealthier individuals have a little bit more confidence and are more eager to engage in what other folks aren't ready to do yet. Bank savings accounts grew by more than $2 trillion in 2020, showing that there is untapped potential for people to spend money. Interestingly, a pair of surveys of business executives showed that their confidence in November rose to a 5-year high as businesses prepared to try to return to normal in 2021. And as you'll see in this graph here, that surveys low, medium, and high income earners. Apparently high income earners are tired of hanging out with their families right now. It's not an activity they want to do as much, but they are more interested in going to a concert, sporting events, going to the gym, seeing their coworkers, and traveling by airplane. So they are a little bit more risk tolerant right now. The workplace has dramatically changed due to COVID, revealing all sorts of new priorities business should have. One of them is adaptability. From the top to bottom, businesses need to be able to adapt. And with leadership, the virus has rewarded leaders who can manage in uncertainty. So moving forward, leaders will need to gracefully change quickly and stay creative during crises. We're also seeing a pivot towards a results-only work environment. As work goes remote, more businesses will shift to a results-based model for employees rather than simply tracking hours. And by 2025, millennials will make up 75% of the workforce, occupying more leadership roles and being able to influence business practices. One of the top goals for millennials is flexibility, which we're seeing now, so expect that priority to stay. We're also seeing Gen Z. These are folks who are 23 and under, roughly, entering the job market. They understand the need for development and to advance professionally and financially. They desire introductory certification badges from employers and online education platforms. And HR is going to need to evolve as remote work and diversity and inclusion initiatives become more pervasive. Women, with many of them being the primary child rearers in the home, working from home poses particular difficulties, and some forecasters believe that women will be twice as likely to leave the workplace than their male counterparts. So clubs will need to prepare and see how they can address this issue. Training is rapidly evolving as millions of people are looking for work, changing careers, finding the right employee for the right skill set, and job requirement is important. So we're seeing an increase in employee training in adjacent, similar, or new skill sets that allow staff to adapt more easily in a changing work environment. For instance, Pepsi launched a new platform that provides articles, podcasts, and training videos to ensure staff have the same career development opportunities as before. And they also provided emotional intelligence training, parenting tips, and other training to build a well-rounded workforce. We're seeing a rise in the number of people who are taking care of their parents, large part due to the pandemic. These are like grocery shopping, driving people around, trying to keep them safe. Just a few years ago, 20% of millennials were performing caregiving tasks. Now that number is up to 40%, which is the same number as Gen Xers. And this is creating a sandwich effect, as many of these individuals are also taking care of their own kids. So they have less time, less money, less investments. And many of these are in those prime club joining years. So clubs should consider that if these are their target members. We're seeing the fitness and wellness industry dramatically adapt as well and change. 34% of gym members will cancel their memberships. That includes 20 million people in total. And so we're seeing a lot of changes right now. Wellness and healthcare is converging, and wellness is benefiting as they're gaining credibility as it becomes more backed by healthcare and healthcare professionals, especially due to coronavirus. We're seeing immune boosters become more popular as people want to maintain and increase their health. And also we're seeing a lot of taboo subjects become more normalized, healthier end-of-life practices, financial therapy and wellness approaches, and a new focus on women's sexual wellness and reproductive health are emerging. We're also seeing products like air purifiers, humidifiers, wardrobe purifiers, which remove pathogens from clothes. They're all trending up as residents and innovators strive to pandemic-proof their homes. And finally, expect beauty products to focus on hygiene as well. Antimicrobial and antibacterial benefits will become more important as people try to stay safe. So that concludes my presentation. I'd like to introduce your next speaker, Frank Vane.
Well, good afternoon, and so nice to be with you, and thanks for that information, Phil. One of the things we've always tried to do with Club Trends is really make that connection between what's happening out there in society and then what clubs can and should be doing, right? That's really the link we're looking for. We really started the studies because many say, well, our club is unique or those sorts of things. And, that's a common, they have characteristics, but we're social organizations. So it's important to understand what's happening in society. So as we look out there, and, as Phil kind of led us off with this notion, clubs in COVID, it's actually been quite a positive environment for them. A little bit, uneven in terms of city clubs having an outsized negative effect at the moment, and country clubs and gated community clubs really benefiting by what's happening out there. So, in a way, COVID's been good for us. It's hard to say that about something that's been so devastating to the society and economy and obviously lives on the one hand, but just as we look from a business practice and a business position, it really helped us overcome this kind of battle we were having in one we call really irrelevance, as society was less certain of the importance of clubs and whether they use them and how they fit in their lifestyle. So clubs turned around last year in a pretty positive way. One, by returning to their roots, and by that we're saying that really the energy was put into our membership, making it a private members club, focusing on their safety and security, not having group activities or outside events, limiting guest access, really becoming in many ways truly a club again for the members, for their demands and services, and totally focused on their needs. And that's one of the key messages today. We don't want you to let that COVID opportunity pass you by. Think about what worked in 2020 and how do we apply that in 2021 and beyond. It will take you back for a minute. I know myself, it was March 13th last year. I was at the end of a lengthy travel week. It was a Friday. I headed back to St. Louis, and I didn't get on a plane again until June, right? And at that time, going into that, we were dealing in a club world where the economy was pretty strong. Again, clubs is a battling sort of irrelevance, or in a way getting members' attention. People busy with family activities or traveling, a lot of work, sort of notions around privacy and exclusivity not so popular in society. All sorts of competition that clubs faced, whether, Phil just talked about all the restaurants have gone out of business. I suspect going into last year, those numbers were almost diametrically opposed to what he described today. More restaurants, more creativity, more competition, clubs and club-like concepts coming on, resorts where massive money was going into and people being able to enjoy a club-like experience there. Declining participation in golf, especially among the younger generation, and figuring out how to create value for that generation was really difficult. And now where Phil describes, some 4 million hospitality jobs gone, I think we were looking to try and fill 4 million hospitality jobs at this time last year. So when you think back, we were in a vastly different place, and searching for answers around these issues. Now, as we look to the future, we want to be thinking about how we position ourselves for the new environment and for what we expect coming out of COVID. In a lot of ways, COVID accelerated trends. All that movement in households and everything is seen. We're gravitating to a society where there was more work from home, but in a lot of ways, companies and people were reluctant to make that leap and say, oh, is that really going to work? Is that an effective way to do business? Other technologies, again, we look at our membership where, maybe some are tech savvy and others aren't. All of a sudden, everybody is able to seemingly get on a Zoom meeting, make payments, order things, shop, all those things that happened as a result of that. Really a world almost of, virtual everything. I was amazed when we started out down this path where virtual wine tastings or other kinds of virtual social events that clubs and others were able to offer, which, you just would never really thought that possibility, but, actually was working, people enjoying it. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the urban flight and the transformation of the home. These are big issues, and they're affecting clubs, and they will affect you in the future. Movement around that, people are leaving the city, so that's maybe negative for your city club segment. They're moving out to suburbs, getting closer to where country clubs are. They're moving the Sun Belt and other areas there. And then within the household, and this is one of the things we're really kind of focused on in McMahon's design department, thinking about the transformation of the home. You look at the home now, people have the, fitness centers, wine rooms, entertainment centers, media rooms, teaching children there, all those sorts of things. And so one of the things we have to ask ourselves as club leaders going forward is, how do we pry people out of their homes and get them to the club? These homes are vastly different, as you'll see with the next slide as to what we're looking at there. We've always talked about the club as a home away from home, right? And it will be that. We're seeing really that, that transition from the club space as these monumental spaces to, again, areas that are more about home, there are more homey, right? Are more quick casual dining, Wi-Fi cafes, pubs. Phil described a lot of what's happening in fitness, moving over to a wellness area, having children's spaces, and then certainly as we look at golf, as to whether it's short courses or putting courses or simulators, all those things are happening, and many of our members have simulators in their households. So think about how you're going to get your members to your club. It's by creating those kinds of spaces. A big takeaway, clearly coming out of the COVID and looking ahead now, and hopefully we're reaching herd immunity. We've got vaccines going mid-year, later year, things are going to start to change. We need to figure out how to capitalize on the interest that has brought to golf and the success that golf has had because of social distancing and because of time shifting and work from home. All those factors, we saw rounds increase for really the most in a very long period of time. And in the 20 years prior to this, most years rounds inched down, not up. We need to be ready for when the economy fully reopens, is how do we keep our members here and playing golf, and again, the lessons learned from 2020. And so we're saying kind of under the cover of COVID here, right? Think about eliminating that stuffy club culture, fun, relaxed, and enjoyable. Leverage the opportunity of new players who came into the game. There were new younger players who came into the game this year, more play by women and participation by children. You want to figure those out and really do that by revamping your golf program. Really looking at that golf program as something that encourages play, invites play, and it does it through innovative programming, teaching, training, practice, and really think about your golfer and the golfer profile. You're going to have golfers within your membership very recreational in their focus. They just want to have fun and play in the Friday night 9 and dine sort of program, to other golfers that are very competitive in their philosophy. They want to compete and play in the club championship and all those sorts of things. Spend some time digging into your membership. Figure out where, who's in those different silos, if you will, and program towards those, and make sure you're getting everyone engaged, no matter where they are on that spectrum. They just want to have fun, so they want to feel like they're playing in the U.S. Open. Find a place for them, identify who they are, and then find a place for them in your golf program. Clearly, there's a lot of capital improvements, programs coming out of the COVID period, and really a demand to invest capital going forward because of, as we're saying, these different physical spaces, right? Creating this member-focused environment, to say whether it's the Wi-Fi cafe or spaces to do remote work, drop-in spaces, how we benefited this year. The clubs that had great outdoor spaces really excelled during the COVID period. And a lesson learned, again, we want to build on those spaces, create those going forward. Again, quick casual dining, repurposing your function spaces. Maybe not going to be using those as much as is in the past, or more spacious outdoor seating areas. Again, thinking about reinventing our facilities based upon the demands we've seen this year and what's worked, right? And what's been really fun and able to leverage your strengths and opportunities. All of that is to align. We mentioned a moment ago the golf program. Again, the reason to invest in facilities is to put in place then programs that drive member engagement, right? Those are the heart of the experience. And again, one of the things that we've really taken away from 2020 is simple works, right? If it's Tuesday night tacos on the terrace, or it's hamburger night, or just sort of quick and simple activities scheduled at different times of day, evening, and weekend, and members look to the club this year to provide those. We seem to we weren't waiting for the entertainment committee to tell us to have this event or that event. The industry got out in front of it, and the clubs that got out in front of it and created these fun events and put them forward. Management was much more responsible for creating those events this year and offering them. We want to continue that going forward. Make sure that you're working your programs and really driving engagement with members going from here. So all that's to say, really thinking about the lessons of the 2020 COVID year, as you say, under that cover of COVID. Really don't let your members forget how important the club was during the pandemic. Matthew Walnut made that point strongly last week when we were on a City Club webinar with him. He's taken some pictures, and he's going to be reminding people what the club did for them during that period. more, extended beyond that, focus on the member experience to create value. It's about the members. Keep it simple, reduce the distractions of other events and activities. Stop chasing commercial activities. Clearly, if a member wants to have their child's wedding at the club, that's a wonderful, activity. But pursuing things beyond that and out of our scope takes us away from what we can and should be doing the best. Focusing on our members, providing the programs, keep it simple, keep it fun, and build on what we've learned from 2020. So I'm going to pass it on to Bill McMahon. He's going to talk about safety and design of club facilities as we move ahead. Bill?
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Frank, and good to be with everyone today as we talk about rejuvenating our club industry, which we're well underway. I can tell you as a firm, we've probably never been busier, which is important. And I think the reason why I'm focusing on the clubhouse and the safety of the clubhouse, because I'm an architect by background, and an architect, though, with a lot of healthcare experience. Before I was heavily involved in clubs, we did major medical centers here in the St. Louis area. And the issue, of course, here is the safety of the clubhouse is where the club member basically live and breathe, basically, as far as getting together, creating that, what we call that community that's so important in a club. If the club doesn't bring people together, build friendships, if it's just a commercial venture, and that's what we got into with a lot of the clubs getting into becoming banquet houses instead of being private clubs where friendships are made. And so to make that clubhouse safer, we really have to look at it and where are the issues that would have the most benefit. When you look at it, it's not going to be changing necessarily the layout of rooms and things like that. But the great majority of clubhouses, some were built well over 100 years ago. Even the clubs in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, had basically very poor ventilation system for heating and cooling systems. Yes, the early ones in the 1900s had none and had no fresh air, no introduction of what we call the healthy air today that's so important. And if you look at the other systems that are there, you had basically kitchens getting much more sophisticated, but their mechanical systems not. Mechanical systems basically in kitchens, you have a big exhaust hood, as we all know, and that exhaust hood basically sucks the air out of all other portions of the club, which so if someone's having a dining area or a ballroom or something, that air is going right through the kitchen, right over the cooking food, right up the ventilator. And one of my good friends, Ron Cruz, he's one of the best kitchen engineers that we ever worked with, said his biggest issue in kitchen design today is dealing with the air movement and how to basically keep in what we call infected air or potentially infected air out of the kitchen. And that means, of course, bringing in lots of fresh air, treating it. It's expensive to treat air. You have to cool hot air and you have to heat cold air and bring it in, then you throw it right back out again. But that's what it takes to have a healthy environment, a healthy air system in that type of areas. And so then also, besides the kitchen, you also have areas where we have a lot of touch, and that is in locker rooms and dining rooms, restrooms, even the fitness area. These are areas where, and that's what's happened to the commercial fitness business, too much touch, too much potential for infection. And so we're looking at our clubhouses on how to improve them, many of which are already built. In fact, not many, 95, 99%. We're not building very many brand new ones. And so it's really going to be coming to have that safer clubhouse is going to be basically how we're going to have a safer air and cooling systems in those buildings. This is one of my, if you look at this, is St. Anthony's Hospital in St. Louis. And before I was in the club business, I was in the hospital business. And I worked for this hospital as the lead architect for over 30 years. Today, there's another 4 floors on top of it. But the features in the systems that we did in healthcare, we can learn a lot in clubs about how to control infection. And it's important. There you have to do it because you have a very exposed patient, that infection can be deadly. Much like what we had today with the COVID situation. And so we had all hospital areas are basically negative and positive controls that can keep infected air out of areas where patients are vulnerable. And in those systems, it's all air, about many times of air filtration, air movement systems, adding filters in those systems. Obviously controlling what we see in hospitals that in a kitchen, in a club, you'll notice that the clean food goes out one door and the dirty food excuse me, comes right back in the same door. And in hospitals, basically, where you're controlling basically these kinds of contamination, the soil dishes never come back into the main kitchen that prepared the food. They're always go through a central decontamination type of process and then brought back clean. Just good common sense procedures, which I think in talking to Ron about, he's saying that that's going to happen in our clubs also if we want to basically have a healthy environment. Also, when you look at our clubs, the areas that are the most fun are probably the areas that are most vulnerable for us as far as picking up something with someone, whether it just be the common cold or something more serious. And so obviously bar lounge areas are areas after a few drinks, everybody kind of lets loose and has a good time. But these are areas, and as in many cities, that bars have been closed because of that potential problem there. Assembly areas and large ballrooms are basically seriously issue because of the, again, lack of ventilation, lack of fresh air coming in. Fitness areas, as I said, dining rooms, cleanliness in all areas, but basically having procedures to keep the clubs friendly and clean basically for the members. And you look at the individual aspects, as I was talking about earlier, the kitchen, I would say, is probably the #1 ventilation area that you have to look at, as well as large groups of members, like in ballrooms and things like that. The fitness aspect is spacing of that equipment now is becoming more important. Fitness, it's had a great run as far as popularity is concerned, but the question mark will be, how will it be affected in the long term? If all the fitness facilities are closing, might be good for us in the context that we're the only ones left standing. But at the same time, there's a lot of fear about those facilities as far as keeping those machines and stuff clean, as well as basically keeping them separated and making and controlling space. I heard a story which was pretty true, that I think a lot of professional athletes were working out with a trainer, about 40 of them, in a large fitness area. And the trainer had the COVID. But the ventilation system in this facility was so good, not one single one of those professional athletes got the COVID, the virus. So again, proving the value of the heating and cooling systems that are there. And another area that's often forgotten in clubs, and which can't be from the viewpoint, is our employee spaces, their locker rooms, their ventilation system. They're always given the most primitive spaces in these buildings. And even into the point when we're doing newer buildings, it's a lesser space. And yet they are, not only is their health important, but they're, everybody, the employee and the member, has to be kept healthy, and they're just as important as the member in these kinds of situations. In looking at ways to improve the environment, this becomes, all right, well, what do we do about it? Heating and air conditioning systems are struggling in these buildings. What do we do? And the issue is, what we see is, you're going to see a recommendation from people of doing existing condition analysis on the safety of the heating and air conditioning systems to prove that they are safe. Much like when we come into a building on any other area for handicap accessibility, fire, even the kitchens themselves are basically have the safety inspections from the health department look at it. We're going to have to look at our buildings from the heating and air conditioning side, but in the same way for a safety and keeping a safe environment for our buildings. And the important thing is not only to have these systems that are here, but also to communicate from a club viewpoint to our members and to our staff how to use them, and also to reassure them that this is a safe place to go, which has been a major boom for the club industry in the context that about 70 to 80% of people know their club, at least they feel their club is a safer environment than an outside restaurant or any other areas. So we want to build upon this, not only to increase the safety, but also to educate our members and staff about it. As we look at the safer clubhouses and how we're going to make them that way, obviously it's important to educate members and staff to obviously don't come to work or don't come to the club when you are ill. It's just common sense. I'm of the old world where if I was sick, I always went to work. I figured I'd live through it, but I may not live through it this time. So it's important so that people be careful about those areas. Obviously, outdoor dining areas and use areas are very important. That's the safest environment you can have, and you're probably going to see expansion of those outdoor areas into the, I'm going to say in the spring, earlier spring, later fall, because of that environment. It makes you feel good. And also, outdoor dining use of clubs is the most popular form of dining that we have today. And then obviously having housekeeping standards, but not only having them, but also monitoring them, making them happen. And so as we look in the future, the environmental safety aspect of our clubhouse is important, as this is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of the club for making it a club. And we've got to make it so that people want to come together and be together. You may play golf, but when you come back, it's the 19th hole or something. The same thing for tennis. You know, you're pretty safe out there on the tennis court when there's just 2 or 4 of you. But when you come inside or you're eating outside on the terrace, there are definite things we have to make it a good environment. And so, as I said before, the issue of we have programs for safety and from an architectural viewpoint, when we look at a building on its fire safety, its length of travel, its number of exits, healthcare, if you don't get an A rating, they close you from your local health department. Handicap accessibility is the federal law now. We have to take care of those buildings in that way. And hazardous storage, hazardous material storage, battery assets and things like that. Those are all there. You're going to see, in our opinion, you're going to have to do with these older buildings, and that means I'm going to say 75 or 80% of clubhouses are going to have to basically look at their heating and cooling systems and their ventilation for safety aspects of their buildings. So at this point, what I'd like to do is introduce my 2 friends, Tom Wallace and Kurt Keebler, and they'll talk about informed leadership. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. Tom and I are thrilled to share with you some of the observations that we've had as we travel around the country. You know, one of the things that Tom and I talk about with our team on a regular basis is the fact that we have the good fortune in most instances of seeing so many high-performing clubs out there, and we're always trying to analyze what makes a club a high performer. I don't think anything that Tom and I are going to share with you here is anything but common sense. The big difference in our minds is that it's just not common practice out there. So as we travel around, and I think Tom and I have been on the road along with the rest of our team since about May 15th. So we've done upwards of, I think, 90 searches in various types this year. So we've been to at least 90 clubs, and I can tell you we probably have done another 40 board retreats on top of that, even during this COVID era. So collectively, we probably see 200 or so clubs this year, and even more than that in most years. We like to think, you know, on one hand, we see the good, the bad, and the ugly. We've actually started to think of it a little bit differently. We see the great high performers. We see those clubs that we think are holding their own. And then we see the highly dysfunctional, why would I want to work there? Why would I want to be a volunteer leader at that club sort of environments? Unfortunately, the bottom bucket is the one that still has a little overflow in it. Anyway, as part of that, we're seeing best practices out there. One of the best practices that we see regularly is the fact that great high performers are doing a great job of educating their constituents out there. They memorialize the standards. They do a great job of really recognizing the foundational success that they need to put in place.
Thanks, Kurt. Yeah, one of the things that we always see in the high performers is they do an outstanding job of making sure that every stakeholder, whether it's a new board member, committee member, new member, or new teammate, is well oriented. They come in, they're educated, they're culturalized, and they're excited and energized as they enter their time in the club. That's very important. You see the best hospitality organizations in the country take the orientation of all their stakeholders very, very, they make that a high priority, and human capital starts with new teammates, again, new members, new committee members, and board members. I just want to underline that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we learned, and we had seen this all along, but we probably learned it even more significantly when Annette Whitley joined us from her Four Seasons background. They wouldn't begin to put a new employee on the floor without, whatever role, without a significant background of orientation and trending. What we like to say, and many of you have heard us all talk about this, probably me more than anybody else, but there's a tagline of a men's clothing store up in the Northeast, Cy Sims Men's Warehouse, which is now defunct, so I know I need a new tagline, but their tagline is an educated consumer is our best customer. We think as we view these high performers out there, they have really put into place that they take every opportunity they can to educate every stakeholder. And the stakeholders, as Tom just noted, are new employees, new members, new committee members, new board members. they just don't take it for granted, or what we all assume that somebody coming in knows what's expected of them. So they do a really good job of communicating, and certainly the trend from COVID in a much better, higher level of communications that just about every just about every club has done, but certainly the high performers have done a great job of staying connected with their members and communicating with them on a much more regular basis. Those clubs that are in that high performing category really break it down. Don't take it for granted. They do a great job of ensuring that mandatory orientations or educational opportunities are in place. And we'd encourage you, based on what we've seen out there, to think of it as education rather than orientation. We've got an opportunity at every step of the way to educate our stakeholders and to get them to understand what it is that we're looking for. And the last piece on this that we've recommended to a whole bunch of organizations in this desire to be transparent, communicate, making sure people are well informed. All you have to do is look at our national congressional family out there, and we've encouraged a lot of folks to put up a picture of Congress in their boardroom to remember what they don't want to be like, where they get entrenched in either side, whichever side you're on, and don't communicate, don't work through transparency, but really in the opposite way. In most clubs, the high performers are doing a much better job of all that.
Thanks, Kurt. Emotional decision making is really a difficult part of all general managers and leaders in the club industry's job. But the way to eliminate that, I had a great search chair that said he has a great culture because he fuels his team with facts. I love what he said. I love when he said that. That's what we need to do as leaders in the industry. We need to fuel our stakeholders with the facts. Explain the why, explain the whys. Why are we doing this? Why did we make that decision? Too often there's a lack of transparency from the manager to his or her team. Too often there's a lack of transparency between the board president, and the membership at large. You have to eliminate that by making sure everybody understands why things are happening. Explain the whys, educate the stakeholders, alleviate emotional decision making, give them the data. Facts are data, and then education up front. Before you make a big decision, have town hall meetings, have some one-on-ones, have some focus groups. Make sure people understand why you're going the direction you're going. It's a lot easier to get buy-in if people feel like they're part of the process.
So weaving education into culture, I think a lot of us recognize the high performers out there, and I think some perspective at times is, when we think of GMs in that case, or members of those clubs, they just got lucky and they've got all the resources and so on. I think if you take it and peel it all back, and you really look at who has woven education in their culture, one of the shining success stories out there that so many of us had pointed to is Carmel Country Club and John Schultz and his environment. I can tell you, they weave education into everything that they do. You look at Joe Kren at Farmington Country Club in Charlottesville. They have really gotten into educating every single constituency group, including the outside constituency groups, the external community. They've done a great job of. Tom and I were recently at the club at Mediterra in Naples. Carmen Masuri, their GM, has created what I think is the best educational development environment and lab in the basement of the club for the staff. They've got a whole reading library and really help to educate all of those groups. We just think that it gets woven into the culture. As Dick Coplin often says, if you don't set your standards, somebody else will. And you want somebody else to be setting your standards. He also will say to Tom and me all the time, this is how we do business around here. And I think those high performers really get the fact that if you don't set it, somebody else is going to make that decision for you. So your focus, and those high performers that we get to see really, really have set that standard and they don't deviate from it.
Thanks, Kurt. Well, if one thing we saw during COVID, we all needed knowledge about what to do and how to handle things in our businesses and at our clubs. And one of the things that we realized right away. We're not experts in COVID, and either our general managers or board members. So we really have to give a plug to the NCA and our other allied associations that did a great job of helping to lead clubs, leaders, board members through the COVID process. I can't compliment Henry and the NCA enough for the work that they did. I think other hospitality associations like hotels, resorts, and restaurants struggled because they didn't have a central place like we did to get us through that. So but it did show that we do lean on one another and we need the education. The board members are not experts in all things that are happening at the club. You're the expert as the leader of the club. You have to make sure that that information, the trends, a pandemic, anything that's happening, you have to feed that education to your members. So it's really important that you're the tip of the spear when it comes to driving that education through your organization.
I hate it, Tom, when you give Henry the plug, but and he does deserve some pretty good credit on this one. So I think lastly, and to summarize all of this for us, yeah, consistency is the key, and consistency really gets back down to discipline. And are you disciplined to do what you say you should be doing? And common sense is just not common practice. How do you make something like this common practice? Those high performers have done so. I think coming out of COVID, what Tom and Dick and I and the rest of the team have seen out there is that status quo is going to be taking a step backwards in the club environment. I think we're going to be, pedal to the metal on the future, trying to stay ahead of all of this. And the best piece of it that we have seen is just educating every step of the way. Every group, don't take anything for granted. You'll likely jump into that high performer category if you're not already there.
Kurt, I would just add another shout out to John at Carmel Country Club. The one thing that I always thought was so important about his committee education was it was mandatory. And right. I think you wouldn't put a new server on the floor unless you had trained them and oriented them. You can't put a new committee member onto a committee. You certainly can't put a new board member that hasn't been oriented. And a member should never be using the club unless they understand the culture and the standards. So mandatory consistency, I think another word we could use there is mandatory. It has to be mandatory in order for it to be effective. Everybody has to partake in it. Everybody has a busy schedule nowadays. A lot of education can start to happen online, but it has to be mandatory.
And I think one final thing on that before we turn it over here in a second is in that mandatory piece, one of the things that we've seen those high performers generally do when they make it mandatory is just because I went through it last year doesn't mean I get a pass this year. If I'm a continuing board member, a continuing committee member, and so on, there's something about the group dynamic when you get to hear from everybody around you at the same time, rather than being a one-off going through an orientation or an educational program. That's powerful. I would also say that whenever you can, we've seen these high performers do a really good job of this. They weave education, as Tom noted, into their agendas. So it isn't something that we do hit and miss. It's woven into the agenda, whether it's a weekly staff meeting agenda, a town hall meeting agenda, a board meeting agenda, a committee meeting agenda, even if it's outside of the committee realm of responsibility. It's been really powerful to see that all happen. And with that, Tom and I are going to turn it over to Chris Davis and David Duval from Club Benchmarking.
Thank you, Kurt and Tom. At Club Benchmarking, we collect an awful lot of financial data about clubs. It gives us the opportunity to assess how clubs use it to their strength or create some weaknesses in managing their finances. And the pandemic served as a dramatic stress test of the various business models. As most of you on the call know, clubs have a very high cost, fixed cost structure, and those are the costs that vary very little based on utilization. They're there no matter what happens. And clubs pay for these costs really from two revenue streams. The more traditional one are membership dues. And then you can also create some money to pay for your fixed costs in the margin on utilization-based revenues. Those things like guest fees or banquets or some of the commercial activities that Frank was referring to. So the dues are typically durable and predictable. The utilization-based margin revenue, that varies if you run into headwinds. And they're impacted by things like the weather, let's see, the economy, or as we now know, pandemics. So when we look at it, clubs that rely most heavily on the margin to cover their costs, we consider them to be leveraged. And Chris is going to build on this in a few minutes on a couple of slides. And then a non-leveraged model is when you're relying more heavily on dues. And like I said, those revenues are very predictable. And on the next slide, there's a long-term ramification of relying on the marginal revenues. Boards are often, you run into shortfalls from time to time if you're going to rely heavily on those marginal sources of cash. And boards are often tempted to redirect capital fees or capital funds to cover those shortfalls. And when they do, it typically takes a toll on the campus. There's deferred maintenance, you're not improving as you should, you put off aspirational improvements, whatever it might be, but the membership experience ultimately is sacrificed. So it's another good reason to rely more heavily on dues and less heavily on the marginal revenues. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Dave. This is one of the metrics coming from our strategic monthly dashboard, which one of the positive things that come out of the pandemic is that we are offering this service to the just shy of 300 clubs that are participating monthly, providing their data, and for that they get real-time visibility into what's happening in the market in 4 reports that show them monthly. That's the member report, the cost of belonging report, initiation fee and joining, and the finance report, which includes operating and finance high-level key performance indicators. From that finance report, this is the year-over-year percentage change in non-dues revenue, which, as the V bottoming out in April would suggest, was the most volatile and visible of all the metrics during the worst of the pandemic. As you can see, it's before the pandemic, and I should say that the green line represents clubs that have golf, clubs with golf, and the orange line represents clubs without golf. Year over year before the pandemic, those percentages were actually up, and as clubs closed down, roughly half of the clubs were closed for some portion of March, and generally every club was closed for the bulk of April. And as some of my colleagues mentioned, due to the innovative programming that clubs pivoted in the second and third quarter, and with the rising popularity of golf, particularly from avid golfers, as you can see, the green line outweighs the orange line. Second and third quarter, there were improvements. In the fourth quarter, unfortunately, started to drop off again as some of the clubs closed, and year to date, clubs with golf is still down 29%, and without golf is down 42%. And what this does is, if we look at the next slide, this is a representation of the blue line is a combination of roughly 1,000 clubs. Their dues ratio is plotted as points on this line. And for those who don't know, the dues ratio is calculated as the annual dues revenue of clubs divided by their total operating revenue. So the median or midpoint, as you can see, is 49%. And that club has roughly half their revenue coming from dues, half coming from non-dues revenue. In the first quadrant, where it says 42% dues ratio at the 25th percentile, left of that is what we call the leveraged operating model clubs. They're getting a higher percentage of their dues, of their revenues rather, from non-dues revenue. So they are reliant on covering their fixed costs more from the margin on non-dues revenue than dues revenue. On the right side of the chart is the member-centric clubs, or the non-leveraged operating model. They have dues revenues higher than 56%, and they are obviously relying more on their dues revenue. So the clubs on the left compete more on price, and they are, yes, their operating dues are generally less expensive, but as we see, the membership experience tends to suffer. Whereas the clubs on the right are committed to providing a compelling member experience, and they compete on value as opposed to price. Now, if we look at the next chart, we can see the two models on either side. The pie chart on the left represents the leveraged operating model, and as you can see, they're relying on almost 60% of their fixed costs are covered by the margin on the non-dues revenue. And on the right is the member-centric model, which they have 70% of those costs are covered by dues. So the biggest drawback of, as we're seeing now, which is magnified in the pandemic, is the volatility of the leverage model, when essentially the source of the major thing that was covering their expenses dried up overnight in March and April of 2020. Came back a little bit, but they were very exposed. They had to pivot a lot harder and quicker than the clubs on the right. And we should, it's noteworthy that when we say the non-dues revenue, that is coming from both members and non-members alike. So the other issue coming out of this is it's a fairness issue, meaning that in the leverage model, the highest users of the club are bearing an unfair proportion of the coverage of the fixed costs, as opposed to the member-centric model, which the operating dues covers that, and it's spread equally to throughout the membership, rather than highest users and the people who use it the least. If we look at the next slide, we were able to impact the effect of the shutdown in terms of dollars. Looking at 2019 data from those 1,000 clubs, which is a normalized year, we looked at the delivery of goods and services that fall outside the member core experience, such as banquets, weddings, guest room rentals, guest fees from non-golf sports such as tennis and fitness. And as we thought, as I mentioned, the leverage clubs had to pivot a lot harder and quicker, because they had the median margin from non-dues revenue in the leverage club was almost $600,000 for the year, which comes out to $1,148 per full member equivalent, or 24% of their operating dues. So this is the amount that they had to overcome to get back to break even in 2020. Whereas opposed to the member-centric clubs, they had just about half of the margin at the median club from non-dues revenue, which comes out to only $725 per FME, or 6% of the operating dues. So a lot less adjustment that the member-centric clubs had to make. With that, I'll turn it back to Dave.
Okay, so there are a few takeaways listed here that you can read now or later as you choose. But was mentioned earlier that there's an opportunity, don't let the opportunity of the pandemic pass you by. I think there's an opportunity here to communicate with your members how much, reinforce how much they valued it last year and now. And there's probably an opportunity to educate them that while some federal programs may have helped float the boat last year, those won't be around always, certainly not in the headwinds ahead, whatever form they may take. And this may be an opportunity to move your club towards a more dues-centric model. And I think with good communication, it'll be easier for your members to understand. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris Coulter.
Thanks very much, Dave and Chris. And I see that we're coming up on the 2 o'clock hour, so I will get through my slides pretty quickly, because hopefully there's some good questions out there. And certainly we've heard some great information today. And really what I'm here to just bring to you is the results of our latest Pulse survey that we're in Club Trends. and just thank all of you who do respond to these, because it really provides not only the McMahon Group, but certainly the Club Leadership Alliance, some really great information to help us educate and all of you on what's going on in the club world. So as you can see, we had about 325 respondents for this latest Pulse survey that you saw in Club Trends. As usual, 67% were in golf and country clubs, 12 in city athletic, and a little bit more than usual, we had 20% of those respondents are located in gated residential communities. In regard to virtual programming, at the time that this was taken, which was early winter, we had 57% of folks were still utilizing some form of virtual. And we see that majority of you, 90%, are going to continue using virtual, which is really great. We see that mostly in committee meetings, board meetings. Couple of points on that. We have heard of clubs using virtual, obviously, and probably had to this past year for their annual meeting, which has caused some clubs to review their bylaws on whether or not voting can be done, which nobody ever thought of through virtual. The other point here too is that our good friends in city clubs found that with their speaker series and a lot of the virtual that they were doing, a lot of their non-resident members were able to engage more in the club because of their offering. So, you know, university clubs that have members all around the world were able to be a part of the club when they normally couldn't be. From a financial and strategic standpoint, we see about clubs' current position, if they've been able to maintain revenues, and we see that 70% of all clubs have maintained revenues. But again, we see obviously more with golf clubs, that's 77%, and unfortunately with city clubs, it's 33%. And as you can imagine, also with the impact that COVID has had on city clubs, reserving for capital improvements, quite a good number for country clubs, but again, city clubs are down to 42%. And looking at post-COVID, a lot of you feel strongly that you'll be able to get your food and beverage revenues back to those pre-pandemic levels. 91% really feel that at least to have some form of confidence that you'll be able to get your food and beverage back. Interestingly, a follow-up there maybe the next is, you know, where you think your banquet business will be. Improvement of facilities post-pandemic, again, really strong numbers. 86% feel that they'll be improving of facilities, which is really great and shows positive impact post-pandemic. As we look at these questions, whether you agree or disagree, is the pandemic, it is more important for club to invest in facilities, really strong with 64% of you felt that or feel that it is important to reinvest in facilities, and we certainly agree with that. Anticipate that your club will maintain a smaller full-time staff. As you can imagine, 9% strongly agree, but with city clubs, that number is up to 70% that they will have smaller full-time staff. And interestingly, with this question on government assistance, I don't know this, and I should have checked prior to whether this question was out before the tax credit came out, because we've certainly heard of a lot of clubs who have really been helped with that tax credit, with tremendous amount of money that really helped without the PPP that clubs were unable to have in the first round. Tax credit really helped, so that's great news. And from a facility standpoint, under this current environment, do you see that you'll be undertaking facility improvements? 76% plan on having some type of capital improvement in 2021. And I think that just ties in with what went on with COVID, that you saw such a influx, especially country clubs, of where your facilities were being used and what you needed to do. And the areas that those will need to be improved upon, almost 96% have something to do with some form of facility, with clubhouse, rackets, pool area, fitness, some of those top areas that we talk about that are most important to our membership. Technology right up there, because obviously probably some of us founded our clubs that we really need to improve upon technology to be able to handle all the virtual and Zoom and everything else that we're doing, and the requirement for internet, et cetera. From a dining standpoint, if depending on tax regulations and such, that hidden gem that saved many of you with to-go dining, are you going to continue that? And obviously, not obviously, but it's a big number, and 94% are going to do that. And is your club exploring new dining concepts? 49% are yes. And again, as Frank mentioned much earlier, under the cover of COVID, clubs were really able to explore and experiment. And as you can see, it's grab and go, outdoor casual, and such. This one was kind of interesting to me. Do you feel that the desire among your members for a club to offer remote workspace stations for member use? And really only 36% said yes. We've seen, and in our conversations, and it ties back to what Philip talked earlier, there was a piece on the news this morning or yesterday, that there are 4 million working women who have left the workforce. And we really think that moving forward that clubs will need, it may not be a workspace, but it's certainly going to be, I think, as Frank mentioned, a drop-in place, a place where we hear a lot of in our focus groups of women who love their children, like being home, but they want a place that they can get away and be at a club. And in the next 3 to 5 years, do you think the club will provide workspaces? And really, that's only a number of might or might not, but about 40%. And I think perhaps we'll see that number grow. And you can see below, from a geographic standpoint, it's more in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And from a membership standpoint, this is a really positive. There's some really positive numbers here about attrition, and really only 21% through COVID felt that attrition would be much worse or somewhat worse. And the higher number of 52% remaining the same, and it will be somewhat better than normal and much better. So that's a real positive trend, and we hope that continues for all clubs. And how does your current initiation fee compare? Again, probably what we expected. Really, no change in initiation fee is the most at 66. But clubs are still, weren't scared to move that needle up 28%, somewhat, and significantly is 4%. Hopefully that's to stay up with the cost of living. And with that was a record speed round to make sure you got a little bit of that information. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Henry with any questions that you all may have. Thanks very much.
Absolutely, Chris. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to stay where you are and invite all the presenters to come back in. Looks like they've already done that, which is great. If you've got any questions that you would like to submit, please go ahead and submit them in the question box. We're a little bit over, so we'll try to do a couple of them as we can. But go ahead, submit those now. And there's one question in there already about receiving the recorded version of the presentation. So yes, all who registered for the webinar will receive a PDF copy of the slides, as well as a recording of this presentation. So with that, Frank, I'll direct the first question to you. You had talked about the phrase, stop chasing the commercial in terms of clubs, going after, the big banquets, the big events, especially the non-member events and outings. So how does a club make that work financially if they're not going to have those big events, if they're going to be more member-centric, like we talked about, like what the sub-headline of this issue of Club Trends was? How do they do that?
Well, it's going to take some study, but Chris Davis there gave us some good outlines around that. It's not the biggest number in the world, right? I mean, when we look at it there, the range there was some $700 to $1,200, and so the average member is not walking around saying I want $100 a month dues increase, but at $100 you make a big dent in that whole thing. And if it's really, again, the member experience and everything that goes with it, there could be value there. So the challenge to everybody is to do the math, right? And that a lot of the conventional wisdom is that it's big money and it's insurmountable. And the reality is some level of events is important to us. Members want to have their own events. It's not going to go to zero. And the mountain you're trying to climb there may not be as high as you think it is. And look for that middle ground. See what it is actually at your club and how can you replace it. And if it's not $100 a month, it'd be a vast increase for most clubs without, not going to something specific like a capital project. If it's $20, $30, $50, but you start your way down that path, the value is going to be there. So you've got to sit down and take a look at it. Club benchmarking of what Chris and David have shown us here today, and other information available from them is a great starting point. Take a look at it, do your math, but what we see is this conventional wisdom consumes everybody. Everybody assumes it's true, that if we have all these events, we're making all this money and it's going to be the answer for us. And the facts don't bear it out. So get that work done in your club, and then see what the response needs to be.
Henry, the other issue, this is Bill, what we're finding, and Chris and I just got back from the University Club up in Grand Rapids, and it basically was a banquet house, and having a lot of revenues. But what they found out is that isn't as profitable as you might think. When they look at all the expense and all the full-time employees they have to have for an event that's going to be some evening, which they have to have them do all day or something, they have found that cutting out banquet basically has cut back expenses even more. And so it's really the bottom line that matters, not the gross volume of revenue. And so I think that's really what you have to look at in these situations.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bill. And actually, stay right there. One for you. A question came in. How do you see the role of fitness wellness centers at country clubs? Is that expanding?
Absolutely.
But if that's for me, Henry, I'll take it.
Yes.
But the issue, when you see the fitness wellness thing, it has definitely been a very important aspect. Like I'll refer to this club we just were at for the last 2 days. They have a separate wellness fitness area. And I would say at least half, this is a city club now, but I think it would still apply to country club. About half the membership that are in there, and at all ages. It was interesting. I thought it would be much younger. That fitness and part of their offering was extremely essential for that club's success. And yet it's a dining club, but we found the entry for the young generation basically was because we had it. Now, after a while, the big fitness, the LA Fitnesses, if they stay in business, all those areas, you can't compete with them because of what they do. But the boutique aspect of it, matching with a good social program in the club, has been very successful for them. So I think, especially like we're talking about, if many of the fitness clubs, and there's a lot of issues. I heard some in Florida that we're dealing with, the big ones, and I'm not going to mention names, but are in really serious financial trouble. The clubs, I think, are basically going to stand to win from this, because they're going to have a program that isn't off the wall as far as all those activities, but it's going to be convenient and there, and good programs. And again, if you're concerned about health, you know who's in that room. They're all your members, and they're basically like you. And it's from the viewpoint of being similar in lifestyle. So I think fitness and wellness is going to continue to prosper in clubs.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Bill. And this is for Kurt and Tom, asking, is the pandemic causing club governance models to change either for the better or for worse? Meaning, has the pandemic helped or hurt the average club manager in terms of credibility and leadership?
You want me to go, Kurt, or you want to go? I think.
Yeah,
Henry,
Tom,
I'll go. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think one of the things we saw is the general managers that took the lead and partnered with the NCA and got the education, started to understand what was going on with the pandemic, and led their club through the pandemic. Really ended up being, people were calling us board members trying to figure out how to keep that, how to keep them in golden handcuffs, how to extend their deals. But there were also a lot of board members and search committees calling us saying, boy, our manager couldn't wait to shut the door and just say the club's closed. So we saw two very different approaches, but I think it's changed governance in a very positive way. I think it's put it's really underlined the importance of the GM COO, but it also has underlined the importance of education, and that education being fed into the club from the GM COO. Kurt, I don't know if you had anything to add there.
Well, I totally agree with that. I think it's also caused many boards to take a step back. I've had more calls from board presidents and club GMs in the last 6 months than I had for the last 20 years in the business, relative to how do we deal with bad behavior. And, either, half the membership was upset because you opened the club, half the membership was upset because you closed the club. And there's no easy, good answer for that sort of thing. But the bad behavior that often stemmed from it is something that club leaders have, grappled with. And I think being led by their GMs who, when they were exceptionally communicative, transparent, and, really cutting through it all and not listening to the noise on either end of that extreme, are the ones that are really successful. But there's probably a reason we've never been busier than we are right now.
Yeah, Henry, one more thing I'd add is it's really underlined succession planning and the need to get the right people on the board. Boards that had people that didn't have the time or the wherewithal to stay engaged and not only be in a monthly board meeting, but a lot of clubs went to one a week virtually or one every day just to talk about what they were doing. The strong board members really shined, and the weak board members and committee members really didn't shine. So it really showed the importance of having the right people on the board, people who can dedicate the time and their efforts towards the club when something like this happens, like a pandemic.
Unselfishly, yes.
Great, thank you very much. We'll do a couple more. We got some great questions coming in, but we want to be respectful of everybody's time. With that, I'll go back to you, Bill Senior, and ties into talking about the safety. Is General Manager Rodin says we have many members drop their fitness membership in 2020 due to not being comfortable in the gym. How best do we get them back?
Well, I think the issue there will be when the general society, when we all have the vaccination and stuff, we're still waiting for him in Missouri. But when people feel safer about the whole environment out there, I think that'll phase out in that regard. I don't think we're going to be able to continue the spacing of equipment like we have done during the pandemic when we could be even open, which we have some clubs that did do that. But that spacing is almost negated the room. We don't have enough space. We can't offer a full program. So I think it's going to come as society comes back to normal. We'll come back to normal in how we use those facilities. It's fortunate for clubs that we didn't bet the house on. We're not just a fitness club. That's just one ancillary service we provide. And so when we can get it back and up and running and stuff like that and support it, and I think I was Kurt or somebody was talking about over there about the communication. We really got to communicate with our members that we do have a safe environment. Like when I was talking about heating and cooling systems, ventilation, you got to tell the members that that's the safest fitness facility in town. And you've got to do it, in that regard. Those are the areas where people are afraid of in those spaces. And also obviously having a good service crew in there. But I feel that those facilities are going to continue. And from what we see, before the pandemic, that was the one area in clubs that was growing continually. We saw almost on a 5-year cycle that we were adding 30 to 50% more space and fitness facilities in that 5-year period. I think that will resume. So let's not throw out the baby with the wash on fitness. I think it's a good activity.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. Frank, this will sort of be a two-part question for you. Many clubs saw a big pickup in activity in some of the capacity constrained areas like the golf course or pool. Are there any things people are doing to manage the challenges this presents in terms of being able to give people the access that they want? And then also, how effective is the role of virtual practices in the future of clubhouses?
Yeah, well, I think on the first one, certainly it's been the reservation system. We even heard on that there was a lot of positive feedback on having reservations at the pool. Kind of stopped some of the folks from camping out there all day and occupying the prime spots. There caused some rotation there. I have other clubs. Personally, I'm a avid golfer. I've never been very excited about the no tee time idea. People espouse that as if that's something great for the club, but frankly, people do everything else by reservation and appointment and lifestyle. With the new technology available to you, you can get the interactions and know who's playing. I mean, the argument for no tee time system was, well, we're going to show up and hang out, and then we'll pair up and we'll go out and play. You can now do that online, right? So you can get that same dynamic there. So you have to, it's wise to use technology as a way to manage those resources where there's pressure there, and you can't really rely on the old policies that were much more laissez-faire when demand was much lower. So you can do it. You figure it out. Use those things. You make those appointments and provide those schedules, and I think you'll see some good results with it. That's sort of virtual, and as you're seeing with the virtual events, I don't know how much. I don't know whether you still have virtual wine tastings, for example, but if you don't have to, but all the other committee meetings and board meetings, the attendance we're getting now at important meetings of the club, informational meetings that we're holding. Tom and Kurt talked about transparency. You can get more members involved in using those. So yeah, we're if anybody was on our city club event a couple weeks ago, really found those clubs kind of breaking down the walls, right? You don't need to be physically at the club. You can connect people through that virtual portal. So we're recommending, really a double down strategy based on your capabilities, the technology, your Wi-Fi capabilities in-house, and use both of those things as well as the appointment part of it to really drive and maximize utilization.
Yeah, and Henry, I would just add that from the virtual piece, I think where we'll see that go moving forward is really from that member-centric and what is the convenience factor for the member. People want to be together, like Frank said, with wine tastings, but the convenience of committee meetings, speaker series where people can't get to the club, older members, those are the things in virtual I think that will continue and continue to grow.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank all of our presenters here today. It was a great insight into what clubs need to do to be member-centric and what it's going to take for them to be successful in many different areas. So I thank all of you for presenting, and for you in the audience, I thank you very much for attending. We look forward to having you join us for our next Club Trends webinar, which will focus on facilities. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you.